heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 321, covering the week of August 15th through August 19th, 2022. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab page, and subscribe to our YouTube page. The YouTube page is great. We have our Abbeville U videos, one of which I'm going to talk about this week. If you like the videos on YouTube, you can always click on that little super thanks button under the videos, and you can donate to the Institute. By the way, we do exist on your generous contributions alone, so if you like our podcast, our website, our conferences, our Zoom webinars, our videos, all the things that we do that do cost money, you can donate to the Institute. And you can do that by going to abbevilleinstitute.org. That's Abbeville, institute.org. You can click on that donate button where it says donate. Just click right there, and you can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. We do appreciate anything you can send our way. It helps keep all of this stuff going in perpetuity, right? And that's the point. We want to be able to be out there and being a voice on the other side of things, because if we're not doing it, nobody else is doing it. And I mean that. When you look at who is writing things for American conservatism now, the southern side of that is often left out, and it's done on purpose, or it's maligned. I mean, this is the point. So to have this counterweight, not just for the left, I mean, in some of the things we do, people would say we're leftists. You know, you're doing it right if people would call you a leftist because you advocate things that are Jeffersonian, that somebody might say, well, that's a leftist position. Or if you're attacking the conservatives because they leave out the South, they leave out Calhoun or Randolph or Macon or the old Republicans, whatever it is, then you know you're doing it right there as well. So we do appreciate all you do to help us. And of course, when you go to abbevilleinstitute.org and you give us an email address, you get a free ebook, you get on our email list, and we send out our daily dose of Dixie. So you get that. Also, while you're there, click on the shop tab, get our logo on great high quality embroidered stuff. You can advertise the Institute that way. Lots of great ways to support the Institute. Rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Share our material around on social media. Download our free mobile app. That's a great thing to do. Again, that costs money, but if you donate, you help support those things. So all of this stuff is there for you. And the website is there for you. And that's what we do on this podcast. Every week we go through the website and we talk about some of the things we publish and putting them in context. And I'll start with the Abbeville U video and kind of work backwards. There's some other things we're gonna talk about this week, but these Abbeville U videos that are on YouTube are great. This is a 6-minute video on William Faulkner. It's a great video talking about Faulkner, and Bill Wilson, who stars in the video, calls Faulkner the greatest American writer. Now, some people have taken issue with this and the comments on social media. Well, how can you say this person or this person, leave these people out? Again, this is subjective, right? I mean, there's nothing to say that what these other people are saying about, well, this Southern writer was great, or this Southern writer who was an American writer was great, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that Dr. Wilson makes a nice case for this in terms of Faulkner being the most important of all American writers. And if you take an American literature course at your university or college, you're going to get Faulkner. You might only get a few stories. A lot of people have trouble with Faulkner and reading Faulkner. He is confusing at times. It's a stream of consciousness, as Dr. Wilson talks about. It can be hard to get through his novels. Most people are familiar with the short story A Rose for Emily. And so you have, these kind of, that's your introduction to Faulkner, typically in a college environment, a college setting. And most people aren't assigned Faulkner outside of that. And it's kind of like, Flannery O'Connor. You get the same thing where you have maybe a couple of short stories that you might get, and then nobody's really assigned any of her novels. Or anything beyond a couple of short stories, I should say. But that's the case with Southern literature in general. You're not going to get William Gilmore Simms. We had a great Zoom webinar on Simms, and I did have somebody write in, and I haven't had a chance to respond yet. So if you're the person you listen to the podcast, I'll get to your email. But very critical of Sims and saying, I don't understand. This guy spends too much time in the flowery language and all these things. It's 19th century language. He spent a lot of time writing detail. And I find this with a lot of 19th century Southern writers. If you look at Augusta Jane Evans, Wilson, for example, it's hard to get through the prose at times, but the story's there. And it was very popular. Sims was very popular. And it shows you what people thought in the 19th century about verbose language. They didn't mind it at all. They liked the detail. They liked the intricacies. And I'll tell you, what's interesting about that is, the modern medium that we have is film and television shows. And one of the more popular shows recently was not produced by a Southerner, but these two shows, Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And Better Call Saul in particular focused on the minutia all the time. It was the detail, the slow pace of the show that drew you in. And I think that's what 19th century literature has. It's the slow pace of it that draws you in. If you want something that's quick, and you want something that doesn't have a lot, it just flies through. It's quick language. It's an easy, breezy. Well, there's lots of literature out there for you like that. But if you want something you got to chew on, and this is what Wilson says about Faulkner. If you can't understand it, read it again, right? You got to chew on it. And this is the case with a lot of things in the 18th and 19th century. It's why they're not as popular and people don't enjoy reading them as much, because you do have to chew on them for a while. It's not an easy read, and you got to understand there's no television to distract you in the 19th century. There's nothing to occupy your time. If you're reading, that is your entertainment, and you are sitting for an extended amount of time reading the material. And it might take you a while to get through the book. You didn't have a Barnes & Noble around the corner or the local bookstore around the corner. You only had a small library, most people. And so books were expensive things. And to have one, it could take you a time to get through it because that was your entertainment for that time. So you didn't want to rush through the book. You wanted to read it and chew on it over days. And you wanted to read it out loud. You wanted family to get around. This is the important thing about literature in the 19th century. People don't realize it was there as your main form of entertainment, and you didn't want it to go away in 2 or 3 days and be done with the book. It wasn't to go sit at the beach and your summer reading your summer, dime store paperback that you just flip through in a few days and you're done. You go buy another one. You had a book and you had to chew on it for a month or more because that's the only entertainment you had for that time period. And when you were done with it, you'd want to read it again. So this is the interesting thing about literature. And again, Faulkner is in that same realm. And but I always, I love the story from Flannery O'Connor where she was teaching a class and somebody came up and said, "This is what I got out of the book," and this things. And she said, "I never even thought about that when I was writing it." So literature has that a quality to it that people can get things out of it that the writer never even intended. It could have been something that was just very easy to understand, but the people that read it get something more out of it than that. And I think Faulkner is one of those individuals. So we love these little 6, 8, 10-minute videos that we do on something, on a topic like Faulkner. We've done one on Jefferson Davis, one on the Sally Hemings myth with Thomas Jefferson, and many, many others, John C. Calhoun and Robert E. Lee. We've done these things, right? The point is to get these videos out there so people can get some accurate, or at least counter. We'll say we'll leave the accurate out of it. I'm going to say it's accurate, but the counter narrative, right? Something that offers something else to the story that you may not get. For example, the Jefferson Davis video with on Jefferson Davis, American Statesman. It's a great video because it gives you the other side of Jefferson Davis. All you're going to get out of Davis, he was a traitor. That's it. He's a traitor. And this is the point. The reason we get that is because of the radical Republican version of American history that came out in the 1860s. That's all that is. You go back and read the radical Republican speeches, that's what you're going to get. If you look at modern American history, and we're going to have one of our scholars write a review of the Yoram Mazzoni book, Conservatism, and all he's doing is simply regurgitating essentially a version of American history that is in line with what the radical Republicans would have said back in the 1860s. That's all he's doing. And so that becomes American conservatism. It's not. Of course, that's not American conservatism at all. But this is what we get. This is what passes for things. So I said, this is when we're on the right side, when we have both sides that don't like us, the left and the right. They don't like us because we're actually telling the truth about things at the Abbeville Institute. So I love that piece, and that fits in with the theme of the week, where we had kind of these dissident voices. And one of those, in two posts, one is the Confessions of a Copperhead, and the other is the Federalists and the Philadelphia Convention. And I want to focus on who is featured in these two particular posts. The Federalists and the Philadelphia Convention is a lecture from our 2004 summer school, which was the second summer school for the Abbeville Institute. And it was by Ross Lentz. Now, Ross Lentz was one of the original scholars in the Institute. He died several years ago. And so he gives a lecture on James Madison and the Federalists at Philadelphia. And what he's doing essentially is bashing James Madison. It's an interesting lecture, and I'm going to get into it in a second. But the other is a book review from Shotwell Press, Confessions of a Copperhead. And the book is by Mark Winchell, who was another one of our early scholars at the Institute who died just a few years back. So we have these two early scholars at the Institute. That's the thing about the Institute. There's people involved in this organization 20 years ago who are no longer with us, who said some really profound and interesting things. Now, Mark Winchell was a professor of literature, I believe, at Clemson University, and Ross Lentz taught in Texas, and he, if my memory serves me correctly, was one of Marshall DeRosa's advisors at one point, when Marshall DeRosa was working on his graduate studies. And so you have these two very important early supporters of the Institute, no longer with us, but still around because we still have what they said about things, of course. And Ross Lentz wrote some really good stuff about Calhoun and the Constitution, and just excellent material. And Mark Winchell wrote some very nice material about the South and Southern culture and the Southern tradition. So let me start with Winchell first. This is a book review by John Devaney, again one of our scholars, and the title of the book is Confessions of a Copperhead. Now, see, Winchell was as I said, was a distinguished scholar in South Carolina, in Clemson. And I want to read the first paragraph. John Devaney says this: "The concept of the South is a peculiar and singular region of America, indeed not quite American except in its vices of racism and violence. It's something of an industry in the halls of academia." Right? So the South is peculiar. It's not really American except in its vices of violence and racism. That's the only thing that makes it American. Otherwise, it's not really American. Numerous university centers and institutes for Southern studies assure us that this is so. Outside of the intelligentsia, this is not the common view. Everyday people from every region of the country feel a strong affinity for the South, her people, and her culture. This has been true for a long time, and not infrequently those who sympathize with the South are subjected to scorn and persecution. During the Civil War, such people were castigated as Copperheads, treacherous snakes hidden in the grass striking at the heels of the righteous saviors of the Union. The existence of Copperheads then and now is troubling to this governing class and their lackeys, and no, not because anyone who is in their right mind truly fears a revival of lynching and segregation. The existence of Copperheads suggests that Southern principles, culture, and mentality have much in them that is true and good, and that they are American, not an aberration to be condemned. It is in this spirit that a self-confessed Copperhead, the late Professor Mark Winchell, wrote his intriguing collection of essays. All right, so Winchell is not originally from the South, but he found in the South, this is an important thing to take away from this, he found in the South something to admire. In Southern culture and the Southern tradition, something to admire. And there's a lot of people out there like that. We run into it all the time. Last week we had a great essay by Julie Payne on this very topic, that people from outside of the South find something in the South that they can admire, because they can look beyond the typical platitudes and slogans that are that are exercised against the South, right? Racism, violence. That's it. This is it. So I love that first paragraph from this review because it speaks to so many people who email us from all over the world. Wow, I really like something about the South. There's something about the Southern tradition. Yeah, we know there's things about, I've said it, the Southern tradition is like a rose. It's beautiful. It has thorns, though. But you don't hack down the whole rose bush because you want to get rid of the thorns. You admire the rose. And so you have to take the good with the bad with the rose bush. And you deal with the thorns. But you admire the rose. And that's what the Southern tradition is. Some have called it a garden. The garden. You have to cultivate the garden. And the garden does have its good and bad. Right? It takes work. And there are weeds in the garden. There are things that aren't always what you want. But it takes work to cultivate and to make it beautiful. And this is where, I think that people are attracted to what we do. And why Faulkner matters. Right? This is why Faulkner matters. This is why, Mark Winchell can go out and write about literary figures. And he can write about music. And he can write about political figures, people in the South that have something to offer modern society outside of the mainstream platitudes and attacks on the South, which in some cases, look, they're valid, right? Some of these things are valid about the downside of different regions and different places. We can say the same thing about anywhere. One of the paragraphs, he says, the book's first section also includes the examination of two Southerners of note, Senators J. William Fulbright of Arkansas and Senator Herman Talmadge of Georgia, whose careers not only act as cautionary tales of the power of gotcha politics and powerful lobbies, but both men's principled stands on the controversial issues of the day undercut the view of the Southern Democrat as a racist political Neanderthal. Fulbright was a principled critic of both the Vietnam War and coerced racial integration, while Talmadge was among the sharpest and incisive critics of President Richard Nixon's authority to engage in illegal actions against the citizens of the United States. Talmadge's questioning of John Ehrlichman uncovered the grave dangers of the more extreme theories of the unitary executive and defended the Castle Doctrine against executive and federal intrusion. Ehrlichman, I don't know why I misspoke there. But this is true. Right, you go back and you look at these 20th century Southern figures. This is Sam Ervin, too. The left couldn't understand how Sam Ervin could be their hero as he's going after Richard Nixon. And on the other hand, here's a man that stood against forced integration. They didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that he was against the Civil Rights Acts. And for Ervin, if you read his autobiography and you read what he said, it was the same thing. It was all unconstitutional federal power. He was always against unconstitutional federal power from the beginning, right? 1950s, as he started opposing the Civil Rights Acts, he said this is unconstitutional. And then what Richard Nixon was doing was unconstitutional. There was no inconsistency there. It was all unconstitutional federal power. And so you could say the same thing about Fulbright or Talmadge. A lot of these people, this is what they were looking at. And that is an important takeaway from this. You're not always going to like the fact that the general government can or cannot do things. But because it cannot do them, you shouldn't have them do it because there's a reason those fences are there. There was a reason these fences were put there to begin with, right? That's the whole point of a tradition. And so, look, when you have a book like this, you should go out and get it. Mark Winchell, if he was still alive, still around today, would be writing for the Institute on a regular basis. He would be writing pieces like he's producing this book on a regular basis. It's just unfortunate he left us far too soon, right? I met Professor Winchell once at an Abbeville Institute event. This was many, many years ago. And he was such a nice man and someone who was really a heavyweight, an intellectual heavyweight. And it's unfortunate that he's gone. And same thing with Ross Lentz, whose summary of James Madison is hilarious. He says he doesn't like Madison. Well, I think that's, if you read enough Madison, you're going to come away with that position, I think, more than anything else. And because James Madison was such a malleable flip-flopper so many times, and because James Madison really was a nationalist, I don't think there's any way to get away from the fact that Madison, at the end of the day, never really changed his tone from, or tune, I should say, from the tone of his pieces, or he never sang a different tune than he was the nationalist leading into Philadelphia. He always was that. Madison wanted to reduce the powers of the states, and he never deviated from that, I don't think. I mean, if you look at the National Republicans, right, and that became the Whigs, you look at Henry Clay. I think Henry Clay and James Madison had more in common than Henry Clay and Thomas Jefferson, for example. Jefferson was always more committed to federalism than Madison. Even if you look at the Virginia resolutions compared to the Kentucky resolutions, Madison's are softer. Madison, later on, when confronted with nullification, tried to burn down Calhoun's position. Right? He was someone who signed, for example, the Second Bank of the United States into existence. Why? Because custom and precedent had made it so. This is a man not to be trusted. I'm not so certain James Madison ever really deviated from his nationalist position, and this is why I think Ross Lentz lets him have it. Little Jimmy was a real problem in this Jeffersonian tradition because he wasn't really a committed Jeffersonian. And I think that's the point of Madison. And Madison, as he points out, even in his Federalist essays, which if you go back and read them, you read Madison's contributions to these, they seem to be more committed to federalism than, say, Hamilton, though maybe not so much. I mean, Hamilton did say some things where you think he's committed to federalism. We know he wasn't. But Madison's point was always to, in Federalist number 10, to try to solve factions, was always to make things bigger so you mitigated factions. But what he's done, and I think what Ross Lentz points out here, so much of what we have in American politics is all factions. Anything can be a faction. Anything can be a faction. And what we get are coalitions of factions now rallying around parties to create a movement. And this is what the left essentially is today. It's a coalition of factions dedicated to one thing, and that is more federal power. As long as there's more federal power, they're okay. It could be anything, right? It could be the environmentalist faction. It could be the social justice faction. It could be the Marxist economics faction. It doesn't matter. As long as we get more federal power, they're committed to it. So bigger is better. And essentially this is what James Madison, what Lentz is saying, Madison believed too, that bigger was better. The bigger the central authority could be, the better it would be to mitigate the importance of faction and the influence of faction in American politics. He was concerned, Madison was concerned about people like Patrick Henry having too much power in the state of Virginia, and you created all these little petty tyrants in these states. Of course, this was personal because James Madison and Patrick Henry really didn't like each other. And Patrick Henry really didn't like James Madison. And I think, that's one of the reasons why Henry worked so hard against the Jeffersonians once the Constitution was ratified, because he thought they were just a bunch of fools. That what they got was, they wanted this big government, and so he was going to hold them to it. Now, of course, I think Henry was also concerned about the French Revolution and what that was going to do, and there were some other things going on with Patrick Henry besides this sticking it to Jefferson and Madison. He didn't like either, and he didn't like Jefferson. I think that Henry, devout Christian, I think he didn't really trust these people in Virginia that weren't dedicated to Christianity like Henry was. And Jefferson and Madison certainly were not in Henry's mind. So there was all kinds of things going on here. But Jefferson said some pretty disparaging things about Henry, and so these people didn't all like each other. But Madison's concern about the factions led to a bigger and bigger situation, bigger and bigger general government. Lentz does say at the end of the piece, and this is a speech, a talk that he gave at the second summer school. He says, "Now, to be fair to Mr. Madison, I must say that he may have thought that no people would be stupid enough to extend itself over the size and sphere that we have. But we never thought about that. We just kept going and going and going, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. The destruction of the local community that Mr. Madison was committed to has been incredibly successful. And the breakdown of that, combined with the increase of population and the increase in the numbers of interests in the political model, has turned Federalist Number 10 into a theoretical nightmare. And I think this is true, right? As it's gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, these are the problems. And so that small community, this is where I'm going to get to that with the last two pieces of the week. And it kind of ties into Faulkner, too. Faulkner wouldn't have been Faulkner without Mississippi. Faulkner wouldn't have been Faulkner without this small community that he was writing about that became the basis for everything in his literature. There is no distinctive Southern literature without a distinctive community. And this is something Sim said. You have to have sectionalism to have good literature. You have to have it. Even Yoram Hazony, who was very critical of the South, understands that you have to have these regional things to make something, to conserve something. He just doesn't like it. He doesn't like that. I mean, we need to be national, but we got to have these regional things. Well, the two are incompatible. Once you create a national identity, you have to have a dominant culture. And to New Englanders, it had to be New England. It couldn't be the South. And so the South had to go away. They talk about it. If we keep the South around, it's going to be a thorn in the side of America forever, because it's the antithesis of what we are. If we don't completely remake the South, this is what Thad Stevens was saying in 1864 and 1865. If we don't completely remake the South, it will always be there to be a thorn in the side of the good United States. This is essentially what conservatives like Yoram Hazony are saying. They don't come out and say it, but if you don't eradicate the southern part of American conservatism and the American tradition, if you don't do that, if you don't get rid of it, then we will always have this thorn. We'll always be called names because people will say, well, the South is just racist, or the conservatives just racist, like John C. Calhoun. Hazony's critique of Russell Kirk, for example, is that he welcomed Calhoun into the fold, and that, of course, opened him up to charges of racism. This is what Harry Jaffa was trying to do by saying equality is conservative. It's a political calculation, and it's incorrect. That's the problem. It's incorrect. And there's so many ways to defend putting Calhoun into the conservative movement or American conservatism as the American conservative without focusing on this positive good speech, because you know what? And I'll say this, most people don't even read it. They don't even know what it says. They just know a line. Slavery is a positive good. But Calhoun was saying it in a specific way, and people don't understand that. And it's not something we would defend today, but he's accepting something as it is at the time. Not as a necessary. I mean, it's a takeoff of the necessary evil idea, but it's a spin on it, but in a different way. And this is what you have to understand about Calhoun. He never defended slavery in the abstract, but this is what Yoram Hazony thinks Calhoun did, defend it in the abstract. He wasn't. He, in fact, said that in the speech. I'm not defending slavery in the abstract. Now, there were some Southerners who did, but Calhoun was not one of them. Calhoun was not an ideologue. Calhoun accepted things as they are and defended things as they are. So that's where people miss this stuff. But when you look at a couple of pieces early in the week, first of all, Capitulation in Virginia, this is a sad story. Anne McLean, who was essentially forced to resign from her appointment to the Virginia Historic Resources Board. She was appointed by Glenn Youngkin, and the governor of Virginia, and because she said some things that aren't in line with what groupthink agrees with today, she was forced to resign. And those things had to do with the South. They had to do with the war. They had to do with things that even 50 years ago nobody would have batted an eye at. But she's saying them now, and of course, because this is not in line with the 3x5 index card of American groupthink, she has to go. And so this is, as Cliff Page points out, this is capitulation. This is the problem we have when you put your faith in politicians. Glenn Youngkin wants to be president of the United States, and he can't have this on his resume. He's fine doing a little softer version of this, but when you actually have somebody come out and say things that they mean, and mean what they say, then you can't have that, right? Because it's not necessarily in line with what people have accepted as being the truth. And essentially your position is Confederate monuments should have never come down because we have a misunderstanding about the war, and we have a misunderstanding about American society, et cetera, et cetera. Again, look, if we are truly a liberal, quote-unquote, society, nobody would say anything about this. Okay, well, she has this opinion. She's one voice on this entire resources board. She may not even get her way. But they wouldn't call for her to resign. This is totalitarianism. It's exactly what it is. You can't call it anything but what it is. If you are a real liberal, you would never support this kind of thing. This is totalitarian tactics. This is, as Cliff Page points out, this is Maoism. This is Leninism. You have to eradicate those that disagree with you because you can't allow them to exist. If they exist, they cause problems because people might believe what they say. In other words, we're living in a Maoist, Leninist American society because you have to eliminate your opponents, whether it's cancel culture, maybe not physically eliminate them, but you cancel them. You get them fired, you get them off the air, you get rid of them. Instead of allowing opinion to listen to these things and say, no, I don't agree with that. Or look, people don't agree with us. That's fine. We don't say any of those people should be eliminated. We can just say what we think about them. Well, I don't agree with this person. They can go out and say whatever they want. But I don't agree with them, and I can say I don't agree with them. And then if you don't agree with me, fine, you agree with them, great. Whatever. But it's the mentality, well, I don't agree with you. You should take your show off the air. Why? Are you a Stalinist? Are you a Leninist? But this is what we get, and this is what you see in Virginia. This is what we're dealing with now, even from quote-unquote conservatives who want to do the exact same thing. Well, I don't agree with you. We should cancel you. We should cancel Calhoun. We should cancel these things. I don't agree with you. You make us look stupid. You make us look bad, whatever it is. This is the problem with modern American society, and I think this piece on the Virginia situation and Anne McLean does a good job with that. And the last thing, I'm going a little long here, the decaying distillery. It's a nice little piece of Southern culture in Virginia and how things, people move on. There's these old buildings and old historic properties, particularly in Virginia, that are not being spoken up for and people don't know anything about. I think I even said on this podcast before that, back in the 1960s in Northern Virginia, the fire departments would burn down these old buildings for practice because people were just trying to clear them out so they could build more subdivisions. And so you have these old structures that nobody knows anything about, but that need to be preserved. So I like this little piece. It's on a distillery for one of the oldest bourbon makers in Virginia, the A. Smith Bowman Company, and it's moved on to another location, but it has this old distillery in what's now Reston, and people are, how do we preserve these buildings, and how do we keep this history alive? And that's the important thing in all of this. So, anyways, hope you enjoyed this week in review at the Abbeville Institute. Until next time, good day.